still regard with awe. It may have held as many as 80,000 people and shook for centuries with a savage entertainment that continues to fascinate and appall. 1,000 gladiators are said to have died here in a single day. Now, the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. Nothing evokes the greatness and brutality of ancient Rome better than the fallen giant known as the Colosseum. This was once the heartbeat of an empire, where huge crowds reveled in gladiatorial combat that reflected and reinforced a larger Roman drama of warfare and conquest, of life and death. In terms of size and scale, this 2,000-year-old stadium with its 4 levels and 80 entrances would be impressive if it were built today. With a capacity that some experts put as high as 80,000, the Colosseum is still one of the largest stadiums in the world, a structural wonder that was built nearly 2,000 years ahead of its time.
This kind of theaters and amphitheaters were realized all over the world during the Roman dominion, but no one ever reached this dimension. From the structural point of view, that was a very relevant accomplishment.
I'm sure it was very impressive 2,000 years ago, as it is today, perhaps even more so, because now we are used to it through our information channels. But there was no television 2,000 years ago. So people, when they came to Rome, that was the first time they actually saw the whole building. So I think it must have been very great.
There's a wonderful line that's attributed to the Venerable Bede, living around 700, who said that as long as the Colosseum stands, Rome will stand, and when the Colosseum falls, Rome will fall, and when Rome falls, the world falls. You can't do any better than that as far as a building's concerned.
Over 160 feet high, 617 feet long, and 512 feet wide, the Colosseum was state-of-the-art until very recent times, featuring a retractable roof that blocked out the sun, and a maze of sophisticated underground staging devices, including elevators and trapdoors that made the production of the most spectacular gladiatorial displays possible. The Colosseum, of course, is more than a stadium. It's an echo chamber that reverberates through history with a roar of a crowd caught up in the bloody spectacle of gladiatorial games.
When you compare it to a building like the Pantheon, for example, or the Vatican, I mean, there's a quietness about those buildings. But quiet is not what you think when you walk up to the Colosseum. You can just hear 50,000 people and see them streaming to that place. It is so clearly a gathering place, and again, an incredible memory that the building has of all of the events that happen there.
Tens of thousands of gladiators died here, along with vast numbers of prisoners of war and criminals who were executed in horrifically varied ways. Countless lions, tigers, elephants, giraffes, and other exotic animals were also slaughtered. The world still struggles to reconcile how Rome, which saw itself as the great civilizing power of its time, could revel in killing on such a scale for nearly 5 centuries as a form of entertainment.
I believe that the Romans would have enjoyed it, and it was exciting. It's a bit like we look now at the television and we had all these Terminators killing people, criminals around the world, and we think it is, of course, a virtual reality, and we don't think about it. I don't think the Romans thought that it was more than that. I think it is just another television show.
The Colosseum wasn't called the Colosseum until many centuries after it was built. In its prime, it was called the Flavian Amphitheater, in honor of the imperial family that authorized its construction. It borrowed the name Colosseum long after it closed, from an enormous 120-foot statue of Nero called the Colossus that stood nearby. Nothing remains of the statue, but a fragment of the massive pedestal that once held it high is still in place, just outside the Colosseum's western facade. The amphitheater, or double theater, was invented specifically to give people a better view of gladiatorial games. Wooden amphitheaters probably appeared as early as the 3rd century BC. But the first stone amphitheater, a simple structure that had 4 entrances and could hold 12,000 people, was built in Pompeii around 70 BC. 100 years later, Rome still did not have a large permanent amphitheater, which was strange because Rome was the largest city in the world, by far, with over 1 million inhabitants, more than twice as many as Alexandria, its nearest rival. Rome was in fact in many ways more like a modern city than an ancient one, incredibly congested, crammed with theaters, temples, palaces, and other great structures, and teeming with a restless population that was hungry for diversion. Around 70 AD, the new emperor Vespasian decided to provide some of that diversion by building an amphitheater worthy of the imperial capital. The architects who designed the new amphitheater faced an enormous set of challenges. To hold so many people, the stadium had to be 4 levels high, with seating on the first 3 and standing room at the top. The outer facade would be classical, even by ancient standards, with repeating tiers of arches and decorated columns laid out according to traditional rules of design. 80 entrances, 76 of them numbered, would make it easy for the huge crowds to get in and out of the amphitheater. Everything about the Colosseum's inner design was also organized with traffic flow in mind. A series of concentric walls, including the outer facade, would create lanes of traffic on all 4 levels. Radial passageways corresponding to the entrances would make it easy for people to get to their seats. And a system of stairways would tie the whole thing together. One of the first and biggest challenges in building the Colosseum was quarrying and hauling the stone for the stadium's 160-foot outer wall. A local form of limestone called travertine was cut into 8 by 3 foot blocks and carried 20 miles from a quarry in the neighboring town of Tivoli. Tivoli still exists, as do its ancient quarries, which yielded 100,000 cubic feet of travertine for the Colosseum facade.
I cannot conceive what 100,000 cubic feet would look like, but it sounds absolutely enormous if you think about it. This would be acres of stone in that one building.
The Romans built a special road just to transport the Colosseum stone, and 200 ox carts made the trip each day. 240,000 cartloads in all. The other major materials used to build the Colosseum were iron, 300 tons of which were used to clamp the blocks into place, tufa, a light but strong local stone, and brick.
It's an integrated system of materials with different structural capacities used in a hierarchical way. They've used travertine piers. Travertine is a kind of limestone. They've used tufa walls, a volcanic stone, not as good as travertine, but still pretty good. Then brick-faced concrete. So this system stitched the whole building together in a fully integrated whole.
Very little is really known about the equipment the Romans used to build the Colosseum. How, for example, could they lift such heavy blocks of stone to such a height? One tantalizing image from the gravestone of a contractor who was commissioned to build a quarter of the Colosseum gives us a glimpse.
It is a very impressive scene of a massive crane which is hauling blocks up with pulleys. The crane is actually operated by a kind of revolving wheel with slaves treading, a treadmill type of arrangement to rotate the crane into position.
The Colosseum took about 10 years to build. Not a bad speed by contemporary standards, but an astonishing one 2,000 years ago.
They didn't have computers, and they didn't have electrical tools or so, and the building is gigantic. And any number of little errors and glitches must have happened that slowed down the construction, but despite all that, they were able to coordinate their building efforts.
Such efforts would soon be put to an equally difficult test. Up next, the labyrinthine underworld of the Colosseum. Archaeologists have found evidence of 110 drinking fountains and 2 very large lavatories in the Colosseum. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. Gladiators once moved through these narrow passageways, along with stagehands, animal handlers, lions, crocodiles, elephants, and other wild beasts captured from the far reaches of the Roman Empire. This is the underworld of the Colosseum. 2 floors worth of twisting corridors and cul-de-sacs that used to be hidden beneath the arena floor, and that once bustled with all the behind-the-scenes activity that made the gladiatorial games and other deadly spectacles possible. Domitian, the younger son of the Emperor Vespasian, built this netherworld, called the Hypogeum, or underground, when he became emperor in 81 AD.
We have to think of a normal theater. Big activities, many people. Here someone is running there, something else is moving ropes, something else is preparing costumes. So let's imagine this very crowded atmosphere down here in narrow spaces like this one.
The staging, the idea that it truly is a labyrinth is amazing, because it's not only an engineering marvel, it's an operational marvel. It truly was this intricate set of passageways that helped to host the event and enhance the spectacle of it. But interestingly enough, if you peeled off the basketball floor or the hockey floor of a modern-day arena, it would look pretty much the same, be built out of slightly different materials.
Archaeologists have been piecing together the complex story of the Colosseum substructure since scientific excavation began in the 1870s. A fascinating part of that story involves the elevators that carried gladiators, animals, and scenery to the arena floor. 32 elevators, specially designed for lions, panthers, and other dangerous animals, ringed the arena at the level of the Hypogeum.
They were brought up from the lower floor in cages, probably operated by some kind of counterpoise system in which the weight is released, and in the process the cage rises, the animal emerged and attracted by the light, and no doubt there was some kind of bait at the top of the ramp which might have encouraged him to charge. And if things were going well, it was possible to get all these animals emerging simultaneously.
Larger hinged platforms or ramps called pegmata were located in the center of the arena. Counterweights were used to lift elephants and other massive animals, as well as spectacular scenery including forests and mountains.
We have no exact idea about how they could recreate in a few seconds, for instance, the volcano Vesuvio. We know that in 3rd century AD, the volcano was rebuilt inside the arena of the Colosseum, and that it appeared suddenly in a triumph of fire and lava. It's unbelievable. But they did it.
In addition to the underground, Domitian added something to the Colosseum that modern stadium spectators only began to grow accustomed to in the last half of the 20th century: a retractable roof. The velarium, as it was called, was made of cloth and unfurled by a detachment of 300 imperial sailors, permanently stationed outside the Colosseum. The awning protected spectators from the burning Mediterranean sun.
Waiting for hours all day in the summer is not easy. So the velarium was a great gift of the Flavian Emperor to give more beauty, even more beauty, more magnificence. magnificence to the stage, to the caviar, and to the Romans.
While the velarium itself has long vanished, physical evidence attesting to its existence is easy to find, in the form of brackets that circle the Colosseum facade, 240 of them in all. Each bracket held a tall beam of wood, much like the mast of a ship. At a signal, the sailors pulled ropes, stretching a 24-ton colored canvas in place. The canvas covered 2/3 of the arena, leaving the center above the arena floor exposed. Traces of the stairways the sailors used to get to their positions inside the Colosseum wall can still be seen. Not much is definitively known about how the velarium worked. Indeed, archaeologists have yet to postulate a credible design to explain how such a large awning could work, given the wind stresses involved.
We know how broadly the velarium worked, that the system of ropes and pulleys could open it and close it, and probably open and close different parts separately, that you didn't have to open the whole thing at once and close it all. But these are still generalities. Exactly how they were attached to the velabrum and where the sailors stood and how they pulled it, that we don't know.
The Colosseum opened in 80 AD in spectacular style, with 100 days of gladiatorial games. 5,000 animals and an unknown number of men would die during a single day of the inaugural bloodfest. For the first 2 years of the Colosseum's life, before Domitian added the hypogeum, gladiators actually fought on water, in mock recreations of famous naval battles.
The arena that in the first phase was completely wooden was dismantled in few hours, and then the basin was flooded because it was connected with an aqueduct, and in few hours spectators could observe sheep fighting inside the Colosseum.
Admission to the Colosseum was free, and tickets in the form of pottery shards were distributed by city officials. A number on the ticket indicated which of the arched entrances to go through. Seating was based strictly on social class. The emperor and VIPs sat on a 13-foot-high stepped marble platform at the first level. Iron bars and netting protected them from animals, weapons, and gore. Middle-class citizens sat on the second tier. Poorer citizens sat on the third. The top level, with steep wooden bleachers and standing room at the back, was reserved for women, the very poor, and slaves. Seats were made of marble, only a few fragments of which remain. As a people mover, able to circulate some of the largest crowds in the ancient world with speed and ease, the Colosseum proved to be phenomenal.
Modern estimations have been something like you could empty that place within 12 minutes or something like that. I mean, that's mind-boggling, isn't it? That people could leave their seats, go to the nearest exit, and from that exit, without crossing over to the second exit's line, could directly go down steps and ramps and exit all along the 360-degree circumference of the building and get dispersed into the great city. And that really was the great achievement of planning of the Colosseum.
The people who poured into the Colosseum no doubt marveled at the magnificent structure as they raced to their seats. But what they were really there for was to see the action of the games. Up next, gladiators, animals, and executions in the arena. The Colosseum was financed with the plunder of Jerusalem, which Rome conquered after a long siege in 70 AD. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. The Colosseum was not the only amphitheater in Rome. In fact, another arena was right next door, the Ludus Magnus, in which gladiators who fought in the Colosseum lived and trained. The fighters, along with their trainers and doctors, lived in barracks around the perimeter of the Ludus Magnus. 3,000 people could watch as they practiced on a fighting field that was less than a third smaller than the one in the Colosseum.
Consider that the size of the Ludus Magnus is more or less the same size size of an amphitheater in a normal town of the empire. We're in Rome, we have the Colosseum. Other cities, they have amphitheaters as big as our Ludus Magnus.
An underground tunnel linked the Ludus Magnus to the Colosseum, enabling the gladiators to make a dramatic entrance onto the field of battle. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, gladiatorial combat was the mass entertainment of its day. But the roots of the gladiator go back to the 4th century BC and the Etruscans, a powerful civilization south of Rome.
They seem to have developed from funerary games where a major warrior died, and then in memory of him, gladiators would fight to the death.
Reflecting their religious origins and entertainment appeal, the Romans had 2 words for gladiatorial combat: munera, originally meaning rites in honor of the dead, and ludi, or games. The Colosseum, of course, was the ultimate stage for gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and other blood sport, which would last from dawn until dark. Condemned criminals who were frequently crucified provided the first blood of the day. To make the executions more entertaining, the victims were sometimes compelled to perform in special plays, known as fatal charades.
The person who was to be executed was made to play a role in a drama. And of course, at the end of the drama, the person was going to die, but as opposed to an actor on a stage, the death was very real, and that the person was executed as the part of the drama.
The main event, signaled by a blast from trumpets, involved the gladiators, who specialized in 20 different styles and forms of fighting, representing the far-flung enemies the Romans had conquered. One of the most popular matchups pitted combatants called retiari, who fought naked with just a trident and a net, against the heavily armored Samnites, named after an Italian people whom the Romans conquered in the 3rd century BC. A wounded gladiator would lay down his weapon and ask for his life. He was judged by the crowd according to his bravery and skill. Interestingly, the thumbs-up verdict of the crowd did not mean what most people think it meant.
Thumbs up is not actually success. Rather, the thumb was up and in towards the chest, and that was the sign of deliver the final blow, stab him in the chest, you see. Or the other one was the thumb down and out, and that indicated throw the sword down and let him off. So those were the 2 options, and it was up to the emperor to decide which it was to be.
Through the years, artists have wrongly depicted the thumbs down sign as a death sentence. In any event, a fallen gladiator who was condemned did what he had taken an oath to do. He assumed the posture of one who was about to die and received the death blow. 2 attendants then examined the body.
He had to be checked that he wasn't faking it. You see, if you might pretend you're dead and get off with it, but just to ensure that that wasn't happening, a slave came along with a branding iron, and if the corpse just lay prostrate with the branding, that was pretty secure. He was dead. But his legs started to flail around and he screamed, then he was faking it, and of course he would be killed anyway, just to make sure that the job was done.
The dead body was dragged through the Porta Libitinaria, or Gate of Death. Contrary to popular notions, a gladiator match didn't always result in a death. Training and maintaining gladiators cost a lot of money, and the institution of the games could not have survived if half the fighters died in every round of combat. In fact, talented gladiators probably fought like boxers today, twice a year, and had a reasonably good chance of a lengthy career. Funerary inscriptions of gladiators boast of dozens of fights. Great fighters were the superstars and sex symbols of their day. Their allure was so great that a number of free Romans voluntarily took the oath to fight to the death. And one emperor, Commodus, appeared in the Colosseum no less than 735 times. After After the gladiators, exotic and dangerous animals were the main attraction in the Colosseum. Indeed, the Romans killed so many animals in the Colosseum and other amphitheaters of the empire that an entire industry of big game hunting and transport thrived, and whole species were exterminated, like the North African elephant and the Caspian tiger. The animals were frequently used to kill prisoners who had been sentenced to die ad bestias. Sometimes they were massacred, hundreds at a time, in lavishly recreated hunts that reaffirmed the power of the empire for the hometown crowd.
This is the entitlement that the Roman people have. It's the success of their empire has made them so wealthy and has given them the kind of power that they can go to these other countries and say, you know, we're taking these animals from you and we're taking them back to Rome. And then that you just put them there in front of the audience and you kill them and you say, you people are worth it, you residents of Rome. You deserve this kind of entertainment.
So much blood shed in the arena, animal and human, all to the hoarse shouts of a huge crowd, as a form of mass entertainment. How do we explain such bloody revels, such barbarous fun? Certainly the atmosphere inside the Colosseum must have been overwhelming, irresistible in its own gruesome way. No less a figure than the Christian philosopher St. Augustine testified to its seductive power, describing the struggle of a religious friend who was dragged against his will to the games.
He shut his eyes and he tried to divert himself with his pure thoughts from the noise and the screaming and the cheering that was going on and the mayhem that was going on all around him, and then there was one almighty roar from the crowd and he just couldn't keep his eyes closed. He had to see. His curiosity got the better of him, and that was the end of him. He became even more devoted to the arena and started to bring his friends along.
Millions of tourists would mull just that question for centuries after the demise of the games. Up next, the long afterlife of the Colosseum, and emergency measures that would keep the monument from collapsing. Contrary to popular myth, there is no conclusive evidence that Christians were ever fed to the lions or otherwise killed in the Colosseum, although they were put to death in many other amphitheaters. The Colosseum will return. The Roman Colosseum held standing room only crowds for gladiatorial death matches, animal massacres, and public executions for nearly 5 centuries. Imagine if Yankee Stadium or the Houston Astrodome had been around that long, packed to the rafters with screaming fans since the 1500s. Inevitably, the Colosseum suffered its share of disasters over such a long span. Perhaps the greatest was caused by a fire that gutted the stadium in 217 AD, destroying the roof, the floor, and the underground substructure. The fire burned so hot, it also melted much of the Colosseum limestone, and it took 20 years to reconstruct the amphitheater, twice the time it took to build it. The renovation looked perfect from the outside, but large parts of the Colosseum facade were rebuilt with fragments of travertine that survived the blaze. Earthquakes, which shook the building every century, also caused serious damage. After a particularly strong quake in the 5th century, wealthy citizens who paid for the repairs proudly inscribed their names on huge blocks around the rim of the arena.
The inscription was a monumental inscription with very, very big letters carved on marble blocks that were put all around the arena. And the inscription was in 2 copies so that the public could read it from each side of the amphitheater.
The Colosseum's glory days were over by the late 4th century, as both the gladiatorial games and the Roman Empire began to decline. Rome no longer had the resources to mount such lavish entertainments.
It would be nice to think that this decline was somehow correlative to the rise of Christianity at the same period in the 4th and the 5th century AD. But in fact, it was probably largely a financial matter, that these games got to be much too expensive to produce at a time when the economy of the Roman Empire was declining.
But the rise of Christianity probably also played a role in silencing the Colosseum. Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 313 AD, and Christians were supposed to abhor gladiatorial games. In 391 AD, a Greek monk named Telemachus flung himself into the arena and tried to separate two gladiators in mid-fight. The inflamed audience stoned Telemachus to death, but the games were finally banned 13 years later in 404 AD. The Colosseum stayed open for another century, attracting smaller and smaller crowds and offering increasingly tawdry animal fights, featuring domestic animals like dogs and cocks.
That means that the idea itself of the show inside Colosseum has greatly changed. In the final phases of life at the Colosseum, we should imagine these shows very close to our idea of circus, more than the classical idea of man fighting a tiger.
The last recorded show involving wild beasts took place in 523 AD. The long life of the Colosseum as an active stadium offering bloody spectacle to screaming fans was over. But the Colosseum's second, much longer life as a legendary ruin that would be put to all manner of uses and abuses was about to begin. As Rome shrank 40-fold to a city of just 25,000, a series of powerful families took over the Colosseum in the 12th century, turning it into a private fortress.
Any building that was secular was fair game to be transformed into a fortress. And amphitheaters are ideal because all you need to do is block up the arched entrances all the way around and you've got yourselves a magnificent fortress. You've saved a lot of space where you don't have to build a wall.
The Colosseum's fortress days came to a sudden end when an earthquake in 1349 knocked down the southern facade, which originally extended to this line. The collapsed wall created a giant quarry of high-grade limestone that local builders immediately began to plunder.
There were thousands and thousands of cartloads of stone material which was sold by the popes to private contractors. A large part of Renaissance Rome, for example, was built out of the material of the Colosseum, and it was certainly used for the Basilica of St. Peter's in the 15th and 16th centuries, and especially in the 16th century, and then also for other churches and major palaces.
In addition to the stone, scavengers removed every bit of iron from the Colosseum, pulling out all the clamps that held the travertine in place and further destabilizing the structure. To this day, nothing holds the Colosseum stone together except gravity and good design. In the Middle Ages, the Colosseum was considered a haunted place, possessed by pagan demons and the spirits of those who died in the arena. It was used as a wool factory, a gunpowder plant, and a dumping ground for the city's manure. It was also a shelter for the homeless, who camped out under its vaulted arcades. In 1744, the Catholic Church decided to turn the Colosseum, evil spirits and all, into a Christian shrine, in memory of the martyrs who had supposedly died inside. A chapel was built on the arena floor, along with 24 stations of the cross. For a time, the Vatican seriously considered converting the entire stadium into a church. An architect named Carlo Fontana designed a basilica. He also made the first detailed studies of the building, as well as a reconstruction of what it looked like in its prime. By the end of the 18th century, the Colosseum was once again one of the most celebrated structures in the world, a spectacular ruin that was considered an essential stop on the European Grand Tour. Poets and painters in particular fell in love with this evocative giant, which became a great symbol of 19th century Romanticism.
It was very romantic to take a walk inside the Colosseum, especially by night with the moon. This huge ruin represents the fall of an enormous empire, whose traces are still visible, but whose ruins are, in a certain way, forgotten.
Despite such interest, the Colosseum was in terrible shape. and the eastern facade nearly collapsed after yet another earthquake in 1806.
So that gave the last push to actually start the restoration work. So the first thing what was done in 1806, 1807 was to build a large brick buttress against this wall which was about to collapse, and just fix it as it was. So this ancient structure with all the fractures which can be seen today, it became like a monument not only of the Colosseum but of its own condition as well. So it was in a very, very fragile condition, and if they had not done this buttress, that part of the Colosseum would have gone.
Roman authorities installed another emergency buttress in 1826. This one was not merely a buttress. It also attempted to reconstruct part of the Colosseum, including the crumbling southern facade. A third intervention, decades later, propped up the endangered western wall and rebuilt long vanished arches and columns with red bricks that clearly differentiate themselves from the original travertine. There would be many more changes in store for the Colosseum. Up next, a reconstruction of the arena floor and the return of spectators and drama. Most of the marble seating in the Colosseum was stolen in the Middle Ages and recycled in palaces and churches throughout Rome. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. The ancient killing field of the Colosseum is today, surprisingly, full of life. But this greenery is nothing compared to the vegetation that flourished here in the 18th and 19th centuries. Every kind of flower, herb, and fruit could be found in the arena floor, a freakish cornucopia of plant life that had no business thriving in Rome.
It was completely overgrown. There were trees growing out of the walls, there were bushes. In fact, there was a whole while that books have been written about the bird life and the vegetation that choked the interior of the Colosseum.
The Colosseum flora was so varied and strange that botanists came to Rome to study and document the plants. Richard Deacon of England illustrated over 420 species. How could the Colosseum give birth to such a varied profusion of plants? Probably from seeds dropped from the fur of the animals that fought in the arena, or from the foreign spectators who brought native foods with them to eat during the games. Unfortunately, the plants, which added greatly to the Colosseum's romantic air, were undermining the foundations of the stadium, and every blade of grass was rooted out in 1870, when the first major excavation of the ruin began. The 18th century Stations of the Cross were still in place, as excavators began clearing away the debris of centuries that had filled in the underground passageways. They quickly unearthed some exciting fragments, including ancient statuary and column capitals. Many of the artifacts are now stored in an underground chamber, off limits to the public. Floral and mythological decorations like these once adorned the Colosseum stairways and walls. Graffiti, like this laurel branch for a victorious gladiator named Amato, was etched into the ancient stone. More than anything, the Colosseum was full of inscriptions, mostly related to identifying exactly who had the right to sit in the best seats.
Behind me you can see an example of a senatorial inscription. That means a stone where they carved the names of the senators who had reserved seats in the first rows of the amphitheater. And on this stone you can read the names of 3 senators. You can see also the names of senators who had this seat before and whose names were erased once they died or they changed place.
Political pressure to use the Colosseum as a nationalistic symbol increased in the 20th century, when the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini came to power. Mussolini saw himself as a direct link to the emperors of old, and he was so enamored with the power and the symbolism of the Colosseum that he actually held rallies on the exposed floor of the ruin. 10 years later, crowds of a different sort gathered under the ancient symbol of Rome to celebrate the fall of Mussolini and the end of World War II. After the war, archaeological work resumed, and excavators continued to make fascinating discoveries, unearthing the bones of people who died in the arena and the skull of a bear pierced by a gladiator's sword. Through the centuries, the Colosseum has managed to survive just about everything, from neglect to plunder to natural disasters to world war. Despite its aura of power and strength, however, the Colosseum is a fragile ruin. Less than half the original structure still stands, and earthquakes continue to pose a devastating threat. Another quake could bring this symbol of eternal Rome crashing down.
It's delicate because the weight is huge and the dimensions are very large. As regards earthquake, the load is a bad component. And it was conceived to resist very well to vertical loads, to static loads. It's different when we have these huge horizontal forces.
Italy's foremost quake-proofing experts have been studying the Colosseum to determine how it will react to seismic stresses.
We are carrying out very up-to-date, sophisticated structural analysis to well understand this complex behavior of the Colosseum under the seismic actions. And that is necessary to do as less as possible, because the interventions have to balance the minimum as regards the respect of the historic value and the maximum to obtain safety levels.
Tourism, pollution, even the rumbling of traffic in the nearby subway, all pose hazards to the Colosseum.
They may accelerate the aging process because the small vibration even can actually make it that the various cracks remain open, dust will go in, will increase it again, and if there is any earthquake or any other thing, that will make it worse.
Not all the changes to the Colosseum have been damaging. People have long dreamed of reviving the Colosseum as a theater of sorts, and that dream was realized in the summer of 2000. The classical Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex was presented on a specially constructed stage that took 5 years and cost nearly $1 million to implement and design. The stage is a partial reconstruction of the arena floor. It will eventually cover 1/2 of the underground, affording tourists a gladiator's eye view of the great stadium.
You must have felt very much alone on that arena floor. 50,000 people, and every one of those people has come not because they're ever going to exhibit any compassion or pity for you, but because they want to see you suffer, they want to see you injured, they want to see you die. And to be there and looking up and seeing, 50,000 pairs of eyes looking down at you, I think that's one of the things that having the floor there is going to help visitors to imagine what it was like to be a victim.
Over 1,900 years old, 1,500 years a ruin, the Colosseum continues to stir the imagination with its grandeur and its savage past. From its birth, it has been a symbol as much as a structure, a symbol of antiquity, of empire, of Rome. Most of all, it has been a symbol of cruelty and death. To this day, the Pope leads an annual Easter procession through the stadium, in memory of those who died within its walls. Death penalty opponents have also laid claim to the Colosseum, rallying here anytime any country in the world renounces capital punishment. As mock gladiators continue to perform at its feet, the ancient stadium strangely does not seem out of place in the heart of modern Rome. So large, so old, it has become finally a symbol of time itself, a kind of colossal sculpture that invites us to contemplate its many meanings.
The History Channel proudly offers the program you're watching on home video for only $24.95 plus shipping and handling. To order, call 1-800-708-1776 or shop online at historychannel.com.
Put yourself in the shoes of every man, woman, and child who has ever lived in